Picture this: a quiet chemistry teacher standing in front of her classroom, her favorite blue dress now stained with scalding coffee that drips onto the floor while cruel laughter echoes from the back row. The hot liquid burns through the fabric and sears her skin. But what burns even more is the humiliation spreading across her face as 30 teenagers witness her public degradation. But what these arrogant students didn't know was that their soft-spoken target possessed a mind capable of chemical calculations that could leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about consequences. They had no idea that the woman they were tormenting had once been responsible for developing compounds so volatile that a single miscalculation could have leveled city blocks. They couldn't have imagined that their gentle teacher had walked away from a lucrative career in pharmaceutical research after creating something so powerful it terrified even her. This is the explosive story of Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a woman who buried her dangerous genius so deep that even she forgot how lethal knowledge could become in the right hands, until one moment of cruelty awakened something that would change everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Rebecca Martinez moved through the sterile corridors of Lincoln Valley High School with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years measuring exact quantities and timing critical reactions. At 31, she possessed the kind of understated intelligence that often went unrecognized in a world that confused volume with authority and aggression with competence. Her shoulder-length black hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her wardrobe consisted entirely of simple blouses, comfortable slacks, and closed-toe shoes that protected her feet from the occasional chemical splash that was inevitable in any working laboratory. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, her dark brown eyes held a depth of knowledge that most people never bothered to explore, assuming that the quiet chemistry teacher was simply another underpaid educator going through the motions of state-mandated curriculum. The small industrial town of Millfield, Pennsylvania, was the kind of place where everyone thought they knew everyone else's story. Nestled in the shadow of defunct steel mills and populated by families who had chosen economic stability over intellectual ambition, Lincoln Valley High School served as the educational hub for this community of 18,000 people. Its concrete and brick structure housing nearly 1,500 students whose futures seemed predetermined by geography and family expectations. Most would graduate to work in the remaining factories or pursue trade careers that required little formal education beyond high school, though a fortunate few might escape to state universities or community colleges that offered pathways to different possibilities. Rebecca had been teaching chemistry at Lincoln Valley for 4 years, during which time she had perfected the art of professional invisibility that allowed her to focus on the aspects of education she genuinely loved without attracting the kind of attention that might lead to uncomfortable questions about her qualifications or background. Her laboratory, room 117, was a sanctuary of sorts where she had installed equipment that far exceeded the school's modest budget, paid for from her own resources and justified as necessary for providing students with authentic scientific experiences. The casual observer would have assumed that Rebecca's elaborate laboratory setup reflected nothing more than dedication to her profession and perhaps a modest inheritance that allowed her to supplement inadequate school funding. What they couldn't have suspected was that the sophisticated equipment represented a fraction of the apparatus she had once commanded in corporate research facilities where her work had attracted attention from government agencies and international competitors who understood the implications of her discoveries. Hidden away in the climate-controlled basement of her modest ranch house on Elm Street sat a collection of research journals, patents, and scientific awards that told a very different story about Rebecca Martinez than the one visible to her colleagues and students. The basement laboratory she had constructed was a scaled-down version of the facilities where she had once developed pharmaceutical compounds that could alter human consciousness with unprecedented precision, or industrial chemicals that could dissolve materials previously considered permanent. The transformation from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, pharmaceutical research scientist, to Rebecca Martinez, high school chemistry teacher, had been as dramatic and complete as any chemical reaction she had ever orchestrated. The decision to abandon her lucrative career had come after a project that had kept her awake for 3 months straight, working around the clock to develop a compound that could neutralize biological weapons while remaining completely undetectable in standard testing protocols. The success of that project had terrified her more than its potential failure ever could have. The realization that she had created something that could be weaponized in ways she couldn't control or predict had shattered her confidence in the ethical foundations of her research. The government contracts and corporate partnerships that had once excited her as opportunities to contribute to human knowledge suddenly felt like participation in activities that could cause unimaginable harm to innocent people. Walking away from a career that had defined her identity since graduate school had required reconstructing herself from the molecular level up, abandoning not only the financial security and professional recognition she had earned, but also the intellectual challenges that had motivated her daily existence. The decision to pursue teaching had been motivated partly by a desire to share her passion for chemistry with young minds, but primarily by the need to find work that felt morally unambiguous and socially beneficial. The transition had been more difficult than she had anticipated, requiring her to suppress instincts and capabilities that had become second nature during her years of advanced research. When she encountered problems in her daily life, her mind automatically began formulating chemical solutions that were far more complex and potentially dangerous than circumstances warranted. The discipline required to think like a high school teacher rather than a research scientist had become a daily exercise in self-restraint and conscious limitation. Rebecca's students at Lincoln Valley saw only the patient woman who explained complex concepts with unusual clarity and created hands-on experiments that made abstract theories tangible and engaging. She had a particular gift for reaching students who struggled with traditional academic subjects, perhaps because she understood what it felt like to possess capabilities that couldn't be easily explained or demonstrated in conventional settings. Her chemistry classes had become some of the most popular electives in the school, despite the subject's reputation for difficulty, because Rebecca had developed teaching methods that connected scientific principles to real-world applications that students could understand and appreciate. She stayed after school to help with homework, wrote detailed feedback on laboratory reports that other teachers might have graded perfunctorily, and created special projects that allowed students to explore their own interests within the framework of chemical science. This dedication to her students' intellectual development made what was about to happen all the more shocking, both to Rebecca and to the few people who thought they understood her character and capabilities. She had successfully hidden her past from colleagues and students who assumed that her extensive knowledge and sophisticated equipment reflected nothing more than enthusiasm for her subject matter and perhaps additional education beyond the minimum requirements for teaching certification. The peaceful existence she had constructed in Millfield was built on foundations that she believed were solid enough to support indefinitely. She had convinced herself that the dangerous knowledge locked away in her memory would remain dormant. As long as she continued to focus on age-appropriate chemistry education and avoided situations that might trigger the problem-solving instincts that had once made her invaluable to research organizations with questionable ethical boundaries. But Rebecca had underestimated the persistence of intellectual habits that had been reinforced through years of intensive training and practical application. The analytical mind that could break down complex molecular structures and predict the outcomes of untested chemical reactions was not something that could be permanently suppressed through force of will alone. When faced with problems that threatened her well-being or that of people she cared about, her brain automatically began processing solutions with the same systematic approach she had once applied to pharmaceutical development. The trouble that would soon transform her carefully controlled life had been developing gradually, like a slow-burning reaction that builds energy over time, before reaching the critical point where dramatic change becomes inevitable. A group of senior students had begun testing the boundaries of acceptable classroom behavior, interpreting Rebecca's gentle corrections and patient explanations as evidence of weakness rather than professionalism. These students had grown accustomed to intimidating teachers who lacked the confidence or institutional support necessary to maintain discipline in environments where teenagers held more social power than the adults supposedly responsible for their education. They had learned to identify targets who could be victimized without consequences, and they had mistakenly placed Rebecca in that category based on her quiet demeanor and reluctance to engage in confrontational behavior. What they didn't understand was that the woman they planned to humiliate possessed knowledge that could have catastrophic consequences if applied without the moral restraints she had spent 4 years developing and reinforcing. The chemistry teacher who seemed so gentle and accommodating was actually someone who understood destruction at the molecular level, someone who had walked away from power that most people couldn't comprehend because she had recognized its potential for harm. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal truths about both the quiet chemistry teacher and the arrogant teenagers who thought they had identified an easy target. Neither side understood that they were about to become part of an equation where the variables were far more dangerous and unpredictable than anyone could have anticipated when the elements first began combining in room 117. The problems had started with Marcus Thompson, a 17-year-old whose natural charisma masked a calculating cruelty that had been nurtured by years of getting away with increasingly aggressive behavior. Tall and athletic with sandy brown hair and the kind of confident smile that charmed adults while intimidating peers, Marcus came from one of Millfield's most influential families. His father owned the largest remaining manufacturing plant in town and served on both the school board and city council, creating a network of protection that had shielded Marcus from meaningful consequences throughout his academic career. Marcus had surrounded himself with carefully chosen followers who amplified his influence while providing him with the social validation he craved. Jake Williams served as his primary enforcer, a stocky teenager whose quick temper and willingness to escalate conflicts made him invaluable for intimidating anyone who might challenge Marcus's authority. Jake's family situation was complicated by his mother's recent remarriage to a man who viewed Jake's aggressive behavior as a sign of strength rather than a problem requiring intervention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The third member of their core group was Connor Davis, whose specialty lay in psychological manipulation rather than physical intimidation. Connor possessed an intuitive understanding of human weakness that he had developed through years of observing family dysfunction and social hierarchies. His ability to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities made him particularly dangerous to targets who might have been able to resist more direct forms of harassment. Together, they had established themselves as the unofficial rulers of Lincoln Valley's senior class, determining social standings and controlling access to parties, relationships, and even academic opportunities through their network of friends and allies. Teachers who challenged their behavior found themselves facing complaints from influential parents, while students who opposed them discovered that their high school experience could become unbearably difficult through systematic exclusion and harassment. Rebecca had initially tried to address their disruptive behavior through conventional channels, speaking with them individually after class and documenting incidents in the detailed reports that she submitted to the administration. Her approach reflected both her genuine belief in the possibility of reaching troubled students and her determination to handle conflicts through professional methods rather than resorting to the more direct problem-solving strategies that her research background had trained her to employ. Principal David Chen, a well-meaning but overwhelmed administrator in his late 40s, had listened to Rebecca's concerns with the kind of polite attention that suggested he had more pressing issues demanding his immediate attention. The school's chronic underfunding and the constant pressure from school board members, who prioritized athletic programs over academic discipline, had created an environment where maintaining order took precedence over addressing the root causes of student behavior problems. Chun's response to Rebecca's reports had been diplomatically worded, but essentially dismissive, suggesting that perhaps she needed to develop more effective classroom management techniques that would prevent problems, rather than simply reporting them after they occurred. The implication that her professional competence was somehow deficient had stung more than Rebecca had expected, forcing her to confront the gap between her actual capabilities and her current professional identity. The escalation had been gradual, but persistent, with Marcus and his friends testing boundaries in ways that became increasingly personal and targeted. They had begun with subtle disruptions during lectures, asking questions designed to waste time rather than clarify understanding, and making comments that were just ambiguous enough to avoid clear disciplinary action while still conveying disrespect and contempt. Rebecca's laboratory sessions had become particular targets for their harassment, as the complex equipment and potentially dangerous chemicals provided numerous opportunities for accidents that could disrupt class while creating safety hazards that forced Rebecca to spend more time on crowd control than on actual instruction. They had learned to time their disruptions for moments when Rebecca was handling volatile substances, forcing her to choose between maintaining safety protocols and addressing their behavior directly. The psychological pressure of constantly monitoring potential threats while trying to maintain focus on complex chemical procedures had begun affecting Rebecca's teaching effectiveness in ways that frustrated her deeply. She found herself simplifying experiments and avoiding demonstrations that required her full attention, knowing that any momentary distraction could be exploited by students who were actively seeking opportunities to create chaos. Dr. Amanda Foster, who taught physics in the classroom adjacent to Rebecca's laboratory, had become her closest ally during this period of escalating tension. Amanda was a veteran educator in her 50s, whose experience with difficult students and unsupportive administrations had taught her to recognize patterns of harassment that less experienced teachers might dismiss as normal teenage behavior. Amanda's observations of the interactions between Rebecca and Marcus's group had convinced her that the situation was developing along dangerous lines that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Her attempts to provide support and advice had been complicated by Rebecca's reluctance to discuss the full extent of the harassment, partly because she was still hoping to resolve the situation through official channels, and partly because she was afraid that acknowledging the problem's severity might trigger responses that she was working hard to keep under control. The turning point had come during a particularly complex laboratory session where Rebecca was demonstrating the synthesis of a compound that required precise timing and temperature control. The experiment was designed to illustrate principles of organic chemistry that would be crucial for students planning to pursue advanced science courses in college, and Rebecca had invested considerable time in preparing materials and safety protocols that would allow the demonstration to proceed without incident. Marcus had chosen that moment to accidentally knock over a rack of test tubes containing preliminary preparations, creating a mess that forced Rebecca to suspend the demonstration while she cleaned up potentially dangerous chemical combinations. The incident had been carefully orchestrated to appear accidental while maximizing disruption and forcing Rebecca to abort an experiment that had taken weeks to prepare. The smirk on Marcus's face as he offered insincere apologies had made it clear that the accident was entirely intentional, designed to humiliate Rebecca while demonstrating his ability to control her classroom environment. The other students had recognized the deliberate nature of his actions, but none had been willing to challenge someone whose social power could make their remaining time at Lincoln Valley miserable. Rebecca's response had been professionally appropriate, but internally devastating. She had cleaned up the spilled chemicals while explaining safety procedures, documented the incident for her administrative reports, and continued with a modified version of the lesson that avoided the more complex demonstration she had planned. But the experience had triggered something deeper and more dangerous than simple frustration with student behavior. For the first time in 4 years, Rebecca had found herself automatically calculating chemical solutions to human problems, her mind running through compounds that could cause temporary incapacitation or permanent psychological effects with no conscious effort on her part. The realization that her buried instincts were reasserting themselves had been terrifying, forcing her to confront the possibility that the peaceful identity she had constructed might not be as stable as she had believed. The weekend following the laboratory incident had been spent in her basement workspace, not conducting any actual experiments, but simply sitting among the equipment and research materials that connected her to the person she had once been. The temptation to synthesize something that would make Marcus and his friends deeply regret their behavior had been almost overwhelming, countered only by the moral principles that had motivated her career change in the first place. Rebecca's internal struggle during those dark hours had involved more than simple anger or desire for revenge. She was wrestling with fundamental questions about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility, power and restraint, individual capability, and social obligation. The compounds she could create were not merely dangerous, but potentially catastrophic if misused. Yet the teenagers tormenting her seemed completely unaware that they were playing with forces far beyond their comprehension. The decision to continue pursuing conventional solutions to her classroom problems had required conscious daily effort, reinforced by reminders of why she had abandoned research work and what she hoped to accomplish through education. But the psychological strain of maintaining that restraint while enduring systematic harassment was beginning to affect other aspects of her life, creating tension and anxiety that she had not experienced since leaving the high-pressure environment of pharmaceutical development. Monday morning had arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Millfield particularly beautiful, but Rebecca had felt none of the seasonal optimism that usually accompanied the changing leaves and cooler temperatures. She had prepared for her classes with unusual care, organizing materials and planning lessons that would minimize opportunities for disruption, while still providing meaningful educational experiences for students who genuinely wanted to learn. Stage was being set for a confrontation that would test every principle Rebecca had developed about the appropriate use of knowledge and power. Marcus and his friends were planning something that would cross lines they didn't understand existed, while Rebecca was struggling to maintain control over instincts and capabilities that were becoming increasingly difficult to suppress under mounting pressure. The Wednesday that would change everything began with an unexpected challenge that should have been Rebecca's first warning that the day would test her in ways she wasn't prepared for. The school's aging heating system had malfunctioned overnight, leaving the building uncomfortably cold and forcing students and teachers to adapt their routines to accommodate the industrial-grade space heaters that maintenance crews had hastily installed throughout the corridors. Rebecca's laboratory was particularly affected because the ventilation system that normally regulated temperature and air quality had been compromised by the heating repairs. The chemical storage areas required precise climate control to prevent dangerous reactions between compounds that were stable under normal conditions, but potentially volatile when exposed to temperature fluctuations. She had arrived at school 2 hours early to check her inventory and relocate sensitive materials to temporary storage areas that could maintain proper conditions. The extra preparation had left her feeling more confident about her ability to maintain laboratory safety despite the challenging conditions. But it had also required her to rearrange her teaching schedule in ways that would prove problematic later in the day. Her advanced chemistry class, which normally met during the second period when she was most alert and focused, had been moved to the fifth period to accommodate a mandatory faculty meeting about the heating crisis and its impact on standardized testing schedules. The timing change meant that Rebecca would be conducting her most complex laboratory session immediately after lunch, when both she and her students would be dealing with post-meal fatigue and the accumulated stress of a disrupted school day. Under normal circumstances, she would have modified her lesson plan to account for these factors, but the heating emergency had left her with insufficient time to prepare alternative materials for the synthesis demonstration she had been planning. For weeks, Lisa Park, one of Rebecca's most dedicated students, had been looking forward to the advanced lab session with unusual anticipation. As a senior planning to major in chemistry at Penn State, Lisa had specifically requested permission to observe the complex synthesis that Rebecca had promised would illustrate principles they would encounter in university-level coursework. Lisa's genuine enthusiasm for chemistry had made her one of Rebecca's favorite students, someone who reminded her of the intellectual curiosity that had originally motivated her own scientific career. The irony that Lisa would become an unwitting witness to the destruction of Rebecca's carefully maintained professional identity was not lost on either of them when they later reflected on the events of that afternoon. Lisa's presence in the laboratory would provide crucial testimony about what transpired, but it would also force her to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between knowledge and power that she had never considered before. Marcus had spent the previous evening finalizing plans for what he and his friends had dubbed Operation Coffee Break, a carefully orchestrated attack designed to humiliate Rebecca in front of her most advanced students while creating maximum disruption to her laboratory activities. The plan had been developed through several weeks of observation and reconnaissance, during which they had identified Rebecca's patterns of movement and the moments when she would be most vulnerable to surprise attacks. The choice of scalding coffee as their weapon had been deliberate and calculated, selected because it would cause both physical discomfort and visible damage to Rebecca's clothing while appearing accidental, enough to avoid serious disciplinary consequences. Marcus had researched the exact temperature at which coffee would cause pain without inflicting injury that might trigger criminal charges, demonstrating the kind of careful planning that made him far more dangerous than typical teenage bullies. Jake Williams had been assigned the role of creating the initial distraction that would position Rebecca in the optimal location for the attack, while Connor Davis would document the incident with his phone to ensure that their triumph could be shared with the broader student body. The video evidence would serve multiple purposes, providing entertainment for their social media followers, while also creating permanent documentation of Rebecca's humiliation that could be used for future harassment. The sophistication of their planning reflected both Marcus's intelligence and his complete lack of empathy for the human consequences of his actions. He had approached the harassment campaign against Rebecca with the same methodical attention to detail that he applied to academic projects, treating her suffering as an interesting problem to be solved rather than recognizing her as a person deserving of basic respect and dignity. Rebecca's morning classes had proceeded without incident, though she had noticed an unusual tension in the atmosphere that seemed to go beyond the typical disruption caused by the heating problems. Students who normally participated actively in discussions had been unusually quiet, while others had seemed restless and distracted in ways that suggested they were anticipating something that she couldn't identify. Dr. Amanda Foster had stopped by Rebecca's laboratory during the lunch break to check on her colleagues' preparations for the afternoon session. Amanda's experience with difficult students had given her an intuitive sense for detecting when trouble was brewing, and her observations of Marcus and his friends during the morning had triggered warning signals that she couldn't quite articulate, but couldn't ignore either. The conversation between the two teachers had been brief but significant. with Amanda expressing concerns about student behavior that were vague enough to avoid, seeming paranoid but specific enough to put Rebecca on alert for potential problems. Amanda's parting advice to trust your instincts if anything feels wrong would prove to be more prophetic than either of them realized at the time. The advanced chemistry students filed into the laboratory at the beginning of fifth period with an energy that Rebecca initially interpreted as excitement about the complex synthesis demonstration she had prepared. Lisa Park took her usual seat in the front row, her notebook open and pen ready as she prepared to document the intricate chemical processes that Rebecca would be demonstrating for the first time at the high school level. Marcus and his collaborators positioned themselves strategically throughout the laboratory, with Jake near the emergency shower station where he could create his assigned distraction, Connor by the windows where his phone camera would have the best lighting conditions, and Marcus himself close to the main demonstration table where Rebecca would be conducting the synthesis. Their positioning appeared random to casual observation, but had been carefully planned to maximize the effectiveness of their coordinated attack. Rebecca began her lesson with the enthusiasm that always characterized her teaching when she was sharing knowledge that genuinely excited her. The synthesis she was demonstrating involved the creation of a complex organic compound through a series of precisely timed reactions that required constant monitoring and adjustment. The process was challenging enough to engage her advanced students while illustrating principles that would be crucial for their future scientific studies. The first 20 minutes of the class proceeded exactly as Rebecca had planned, with students asking thoughtful questions and taking detailed notes as she guided them through the theoretical background necessary to understand the practical demonstration. Lisa Park was particularly engaged, asking questions that demonstrated both her preparation for the lesson and her genuine curiosity about the molecular interactions that governed the chemical processes. Rebecca's confidence in her ability to manage both the complex chemistry and her challenging students had been building throughout the successful opening portion of the class. She had begun to think that perhaps her concerns about Marcus and his friends had been overblown, that they might actually be capable of behaving appropriately when presented with genuinely interesting academic material. The moment when everything changed came during the most critical phase of the synthesis, when Rebecca was adding a catalyst that required precise temperature control and timing to prevent the reaction from becoming dangerously unstable. She was completely focused on the delicate process of maintaining optimal conditions while explaining the chemical principles involved to her students, her attention necessarily divided between safety protocols and educational objectives. Jake Williams chose that precise moment to trigger the fire alarm near the emergency shower station, creating a piercing sound that startled everyone in the laboratory and forced Rebecca to look up from her careful work. The distraction lasted only seconds, but it was long enough for Marcus to execute the central element of their plan with the timing and precision of someone who had rehearsed the attack multiple times. The cup of scalding coffee that Marcus threw across the laboratory caught Rebecca completely off guard, striking her in the chest and soaking through her blue dress with liquid that was hot enough to cause immediate pain without inflicting injuries that would require medical attention. The shock of the physical assault, combined with the humiliation of being attacked in front of her students, created a moment of complete vulnerability that Marcus had calculated would leave her helpless and demoralized. But Marcus had made a fundamental error in his assessment of his target. The woman he had attacked was not simply a mild-mannered chemistry teacher who could be victimized without consequence. She was someone whose mind contained knowledge that could have catastrophic implications if applied without moral restraints. Someone who had spent years suppressing instincts and capabilities that were now awakening in response to a direct threat to her safety and dignity. The coffee-stained dress clinging to her skin was becoming the least of anyone's concerns as Rebecca's analytical mind began processing the situation with the kind of systematic approach she had once applied to pharmaceutical development. The gentle teacher who had patiently endured weeks of harassment was transforming into something far more dangerous than Marcus or his friends could have imagined when they planned their harmless prank. The chemical synthesis that had been interrupted by their attack suddenly seemed less important than the far more dangerous reactions that were beginning to occur in Rebecca's mind as she contemplated responses that went far beyond anything that would be considered appropriate for a high school classroom. The molecular knowledge that she had tried so hard to suppress was reasserting itself with terrifying clarity, offering solutions to her harassment problem that were as elegant as they were devastating. The silence that followed the coffee attack lasted exactly 3.7 seconds, a measurement that Rebecca's mind calculated automatically as she processed the temperature of the liquid, the surface area of contact with her skin, and the precise molecular composition of the stain spreading across her dress. What her students witnessed in those crucial seconds was a transformation so complete and so unexpected that several of them would later struggle to articulate what they had seen. The gentle chemistry teacher who had been patiently explaining molecular structures was replaced by someone whose eyes held a calculating intensity that belonged in research laboratories, where mistakes could have global consequences. Rebecca's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her weight redistributing in ways that suggested readiness for action rather than the defensive vulnerability that Marcus had expected his attack to produce. Lisa Park noticed the change immediately, her academic mind recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented in her educational experience. The woman standing at the front of the laboratory was still recognizably Dr. Martinez, but there was something fundamentally different about her presence, something that suggested capabilities and knowledge that extended far beyond high school chemistry instruction. Marcus was still laughing at his successful execution of the coffee attack when Rebecca's voice cut through the laboratory with a clarity and authority that commanded immediate attention from every person in the room. Her words were measured and precise, delivered with the kind of calm intensity that made it clear she was operating from a place of complete control rather than emotional reaction. She began by identifying the exact chemical composition of the coffee that had been thrown at her, detailing the pH levels, temperature range, and potential reactions with the synthetic fibers in her dress. Her analysis was delivered with scientific precision that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what would be necessary for a typical chemistry teacher to possess, suggesting familiarity with molecular interactions at levels that belonged in advanced research settings. The students listening to her impromptu lecture found themselves fascinated despite the unusual circumstances, drawn in by the depth and sophistication of information that Rebecca was sharing with an ease that suggested this level of analysis was natural and automatic for her. Even Marcus had stopped laughing as he tried to process the fact that his target was responding to humiliation with a demonstration of intellectual capability that he hadn't expected. Rebecca's discussion of coffee chemistry was actually serving a dual purpose, providing her students with genuine educational content while simultaneously allowing her mind to process potential responses to the attack she had just experienced. Her analytical thinking was operating on multiple levels simultaneously, calculating both the educational value of the impromptu lesson and the various chemical options available for addressing the harassment problem that had just escalated beyond acceptable boundaries. Connor Davis had been recording the incident on his phone since the moment Marcus threw the coffee, expecting to capture footage of a humiliated teacher cowering from teenage bullies. Instead, he was documenting something far more complex and potentially dangerous, though he lacked the knowledge necessary to understand what he was actually witnessing. As Rebecca's hidden expertise began to emerge, the transition from coffee chemistry to broader molecular principles happened so smoothly that most students didn't realize they were receiving an advanced lesson that belonged in graduate-level coursework rather than high school instruction. Rebecca began describing the synthesis of compounds that could alter human perception, affect nervous system function, or modify physiological responses in ways that were both fascinating and terrifying. Jake Williams had been expecting Rebecca to either break down in tears or angrily demand administrative intervention, responses that would have confirmed their assessment of her as weak and easily victimized. Instead, he found himself listening to a detailed explanation of how certain organic compounds could cause temporary paralysis by interfering with neurotransmitter function, delivered with the casual expertise of someone who had clearly worked with such substances professionally. The realization that their mild-mannered chemistry teacher possessed knowledge that could be weaponized in ways they hadn't considered was beginning to penetrate the consciousness of Marcus and his friends. Though their teenage arrogance prevented them from fully grasping the implications of what they were hearing. They had expected to humiliate someone they perceived as powerless, but were instead discovering that they had attacked someone whose capabilities extended far beyond their comprehension. Rebecca's impromptu lecture on neurotoxins and their mechanisms of action was academically fascinating, but also served as a subtle warning about the consequences of underestimating someone based on superficial appearances. She described in clinical detail how certain compounds could cause effects ranging from mild discomfort to complete incapacitation, always maintaining the professional tone of an educator, while simultaneously demonstrating knowledge that suggested dangerous capabilities. Lisa Park was taking notes with growing amazement, recognizing that she was receiving insights into chemistry that would normally require years of advanced study to encounter. Her admiration for Dr. Martinez was growing even as she began to understand that her teacher's background included experiences and knowledge that went far beyond typical educational credentials the other students in the laboratory were processing the demonstration with varying degrees of comprehension, but all of them recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The woman they had known as a quiet chemistry teacher was revealing depths of expertise that transformed their understanding of both her qualifications and her potential responses to disrespectful behavior. Dr. Amanda Foster had been walking past the laboratory when she heard Rebecca's voice taking on the authoritative tone that suggested something significant was happening. Her decision to pause outside the door and listen to the ongoing lesson proved crucial, as she became the only adult witness to Rebecca's demonstration of capabilities that went far beyond standard teaching requirements. Amanda's experience with educational emergencies told her that intervention might be necessary, but her professional curiosity about Rebecca's unexpected expertise kept her listening as the lesson continued to reveal knowledge that belonged in advanced research settings. She was beginning to understand that her colleague's background included experiences that had never been mentioned in casual conversations or professional meetings. The turning point in Rebecca's demonstration came when she began describing the synthesis of compounds that could be created using materials readily available in a standard high school chemistry laboratory. Her explanation was theoretically sound and educationally valuable, but it also served as a clear warning about what could happen if someone with sufficient knowledge decided to move beyond theoretical discussions to practical applications. Marcus had finally stopped finding the situation amusing as he began to comprehend that the woman he had attacked possessed knowledge that could make his life extremely unpleasant if she chose to apply it practically rather than theoretically. His confidence in his own untouchability was being undermined by the growing realization that he might have seriously misjudged his target's capabilities and potential responses. The chemistry lesson that had begun as an improvised response to a humiliating attack was becoming something far more significant as Rebecca found herself acknowledging aspects of her expertise that she had kept hidden for years. The knowledge that she had tried to suppress was emerging naturally and automatically as she processed the situation and calculated appropriate responses to the harassment she had endured. Rebecca's description of how certain compounds could be absorbed through skin contact was delivered with the same professional tone she used for all her educational content, But the practical implications were becoming clear to everyone in the laboratory. She was not merely sharing interesting chemical facts, but was demonstrating that she possessed both the knowledge and the access to materials necessary to create substances that could have serious consequences for anyone who continued to harass her. The coffee stain on her dress had become a symbol of transformation rather than humiliation, as Rebecca used the attack as a catalyst for revealing the dangerous knowledge that made her far more formidable than any of her tormentors had imagined. The gentle teacher was still present, but she was now accompanied by the research scientist who understood molecular interactions at levels that could be weaponized if circumstances required such extreme measures. The final element of Rebecca's demonstration involved a detailed explanation of how chemical reactions could be delayed or triggered by environmental factors, allowing for precise timing of effects that could occur hours or even days after initial exposure. Her expertise in controlled release compounds was particularly impressive, suggesting familiarity with pharmaceutical development techniques that belonged in corporate research facilities rather than high school laboratories. As Rebecca concluded her impromptu lesson and returned her attention to the original synthesis demonstration, the atmosphere in the laboratory had been fundamentally transformed. The students who had witnessed her display of advanced knowledge understood that they had been privileged to observe something extraordinary, while Marcus and his friends were beginning to realize that their harassment campaign had awakened something far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. The coffee that had been intended to humiliate and demoralize had instead triggered a revelation that changed everyone's understanding of who Dr. Rebecca Martinez really was, and what she was capable of when pushed beyond her carefully maintained boundaries of professional restraint. The final bell of the day had barely finished ringing when word of the extraordinary events in room 117 began spreading through Lincoln Valley High School with the velocity of a chemical chain reaction. Students who had witnessed Rebecca's demonstration of advanced chemistry knowledge were sharing accounts that seemed almost impossible to believe, describing a mild-mannered teacher who had responded to a bullying attack by revealing expertise that belonged in classified research facilities rather than public education. Principal Chun received his first report of the incident within minutes of dismissal, though the details were so unusual that he initially suspected the students were exaggerating a routine disciplinary situation. The idea that Rebecca Martinez possessed the kind of dangerous knowledge being described seemed inconsistent with everything he knew about her background and qualifications, but the consistency of multiple witness accounts forced him to take the reports seriously. Detective Sarah Morrison of the Millfield Police Department had been conducting a routine visit to Lincoln Valley when she overheard students discussing what they claimed was a teacher's detailed description of how to synthesize incapacitating compounds using common laboratory materials. Her 15 years of experience in law enforcement had taught her to recognize potential threats even when they were embedded in seemingly academic contexts, and the specificity of the students' accounts triggered professional concerns that required immediate investigation. The emergency faculty meeting, called by Principal Chun, brought together teachers and administrators who were struggling to understand how a coffee-throwing incident had escalated into discussions of chemical weapons and pharmaceutical research. Dr. Amanda Foster's account of what she had witnessed outside the laboratory provided crucial context for understanding the scope of Rebecca's knowledge, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about what other capabilities their colleague might be concealing. Rebecca had used the time immediately following the incident to secure her laboratory and document the events in detailed reports that would protect both her professional standing and her legal position if the situation required official intervention. Her documentation was thorough and precise, reflecting the same analytical approach she applied to all aspects of her work, but it also revealed the extent to which she had been calculating responses to harassment that went far beyond typical educational concerns. The decision to contact Rebecca's former research supervisor at Pharmacorp Industries had been made by Detective Morrison, who understood that verifying the teacher's claimed expertise would be crucial for assessing the potential threat level. Represented by someone who claimed to understand dangerous chemistry at professional levels. The conversation that followed would transform a local school discipline issue into a matter of regional security concern. Dr. Elizabeth Yang had been Rebecca's mentor during her years in pharmaceutical development, and her immediate recognition of Rebecca's voice during the detective's phone call confirmed both the authenticity of her former student's expertise and the legitimate reasons for her career change. Dr. Yang's explanation of Rebecca's research background provided context that made her current situation both more understandable and more dangerous than anyone at Lincoln Valley had realized. The revelation that their chemistry teacher had once been responsible for developing compounds that were classified at federal levels due to their potential for weaponization sent shockwaves through the school administration that extended far beyond typical concerns about student safety and teacher qualifications. The fact that someone with such dangerous knowledge had been working in their facility for 4 years without disclosure raised questions about background check procedures and professional transparency requirements. Marcus Thompson's parents received a phone call from Principal Chun that evening that would fundamentally alter their understanding of both their son's behavior and the potential consequences of his actions. The explanation that Marcus had attacked someone whose expertise included the synthesis of compounds that could cause serious harm forced them to confront the reality that their son's harassment campaign had targeted someone far more dangerous than they had realized. The emergency school board meeting convened that evening brought together community leaders who were struggling to balance multiple competing concerns about public safety, educational mission, and legal liability. The presence of Detective Morrison and a representative from the county prosecutor's office indicated that the situation had moved beyond typical school disciplinary procedures into territory that required law enforcement involvement. Jake Williams had spent the hours since the incident researching the chemical compounds that Rebecca had described during her impromptu lesson, using internet resources to verify the accuracy of her explanations and the feasibility of the synthesis methods she had outlined. His discoveries confirmed that their chemistry teacher possessed knowledge that could be extremely dangerous if applied maliciously, forcing him to confront the possibility that their harmless prank had provoked someone capable of serious retaliation. Connor Davis had been reviewing the video footage he had captured during the coffee attack, trying to understand how what should have been documentation of their victims' humiliation had instead become evidence of knowledge and capabilities that transformed Rebecca from target to potential threat. The sophisticated chemical explanations that he had recorded demonstrated expertise that belonged in graduate-level research rather than high school education. The psychological evaluation that Rebecca underwent at the request of both school administration and law enforcement was conducted by Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a forensic psychologist with experience in assessing individuals whose professional knowledge could be weaponized under stress conditions. His interview with Rebecca revealed both the depth of her technical expertise and the moral restraints that had prevented her from applying that knowledge inappropriately despite months of harassment. Dr. Rodriguez's assessment confirmed that Rebecca represented no threat to student safety under normal circumstances, but it also acknowledged that her knowledge base included information that could be dangerous if applied without the ethical constraints that had governed her behavior throughout her teaching career. His recommendation that she be allowed to continue teaching with appropriate supervision reflected both her value as an educator and the need for ongoing monitoring of someone with her unique capabilities. The legal proceedings against Marcus, Jake, and Connor began with charges that seemed almost anticlimactic given the dramatic revelations about their victim's background. The assault charges related to the coffee attack were straightforward, but the discovery of Rebecca's research history added complexity to the case by raising questions about whether the students could have reasonably anticipated the consequences of attacking someone with her particular expertise. The defense attorney assigned to represent Marcus had the challenging task of arguing that his client's actions were typical teenage misbehavior that should not be subject to enhanced penalties simply because the victim possessed unusual knowledge and capabilities. The prosecution, meanwhile, argued that attacking any teacher constituted assault regardless of the victim's background, and that the defendant's systematic harassment campaign demonstrated malicious intent that warranted serious consequences. Rebecca's testimony during the preliminary hearings provided public confirmation of her research background, while also demonstrating the restraint and professionalism that had characterized her response to months of harassment. Her detailed account of the chemical compound she could synthesize using school laboratory materials served both to educate the court about the potential dangers represented by someone with her expertise and to emphasize her commitment to using that knowledge only for educational purposes. The media attention surrounding the case attracted national interest from education policy experts, law enforcement professionals, and security analysts who were fascinated by the implications of having someone with classified research experience working in public education without disclosure. The debates that emerged from the coverage raised important questions about the balance between individual privacy rights and institutional security concerns in educational settings. Lisa Park had become an unexpected celebrity among her peers. As one of the primary witnesses to Rebecca's demonstration of advanced chemistry knowledge, her detailed notes from the incident provided valuable documentation of exactly what had been revealed during the impromptu lesson, but they also forced her to confront complex questions about the relationship between knowledge and power that she had never considered before. The transformation of Room 117 from a typical high school chemistry laboratory into what security experts described as a potential weapons development facility highlighted the challenges facing educational institutions that employed personnel with advanced technical knowledge. The recommendations for enhanced background checks and ongoing monitoring of employees with potentially dangerous expertise would influence hiring practices at schools throughout the region. Rebecca's decision to embrace rather than hide her research background marked the beginning of a new phase in her career that would integrate her educational mission with her technical expertise in ways that served broader community needs. The woman who had spent 4 years concealing her dangerous knowledge was discovering that acknowledging and controlling that knowledge might be more effective than attempting to suppress it entirely. The coffee stain that had triggered the revelation of Rebecca's hidden capabilities had been removed from her dress, but the consequences of that moment of attack and response would continue to influence her life and career for years to come. The gentle chemistry teacher had revealed the dangerous scientist beneath, creating new possibilities for service and contribution that extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of public education. 6 months after the coffee incident, Lincoln Valley High School had become an unlikely model for innovative educational security programs that attracted visitors from across the country. The transformation began when the Department of Homeland Security approached Rebecca with a proposal that would revolutionize how schools addressed threats while maintaining their educational mission. Her unique combination of dangerous knowledge and educational expertise made her invaluable for developing training programs that could protect students and teachers without creating an atmosphere of fear. The pilot program that Rebecca designed integrated chemistry education with practical security awareness, teaching students to recognize and respond to potential chemical threats, while deepening their understanding of molecular science. Her curriculum became a national template for STEM education that addressed real-world safety concerns, while engaging students with hands-on learning experiences that prepared them for careers in forensic science, chemical safety, and homeland security. Marcus Thompson's transformation from arrogant bully to humbled community service volunteer had become one of the most compelling aspects of the broader story. His court-mandated counseling sessions with Dr. Rodriguez had forced him to confront the psychological factors that had driven his need to dominate and humiliate others, while his community service assignment working with elementary school children had given him opportunities to model positive behavior rather than destructive patterns. The young man who had once sought power through intimidation was discovering that genuine leadership required empathy, responsibility, and the courage to admit mistakes. His public apology to Rebecca, delivered during a school board meeting 6 months after the incident, demonstrated personal growth that surprised everyone who had known him during his reign of terror at Lincoln Valley. Jake Williams had used his court-ordered anger management therapy to address the family dysfunction that had contributed to his aggressive behavior patterns. His mother's divorce from his abusive stepfather had removed a major source of stress from his environment, while his participation in peer mediation training had given him constructive outlets for his natural intensity and protective instincts. Football coach who had previously encouraged Jake's aggression as a positive trait on the field had been replaced by someone who emphasized discipline, teamwork, and respect for opponents. Jake's evolution from enforcer to mentor for younger players reflected broader changes in the school's athletic culture that prioritized character development alongside competitive success. Connor Davis had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation of the 3 former bullies, channeling his psychological manipulation skills into legitimate forensic psychology studies that would prepare him for a career helping law enforcement understand criminal behavior patterns. His natural ability to read and influence others had been redirected toward constructive purposes that served community welfare rather than personal gratification. The documentary that Connor was producing about his own rehabilitation process had attracted attention from juvenile justice experts who were interested in his insights into the mindset and motivations that drove teenage harassment campaigns. His willingness to examine and publicly discuss his own destructive behavior provided valuable perspectives for developing more effective intervention strategies. Dr. Amanda Foster had accepted a promotion to assistant principal, specifically to oversee the implementation of security education programs that integrated academic learning with practical safety skills. Her experience as Rebecca's friend and colleague during the crisis had given her unique insights into the challenges faced by educators who possessed knowledge or capabilities that extended beyond traditional teaching requirements. Amanda's new role involved developing policies for background disclosure, requirements that balanced institutional security needs with individual privacy rights. Her work was influencing educational administration practices throughout Pennsylvania as school districts struggled to adapt to new realities about the diverse backgrounds and expertise of their personnel. The relationship between Rebecca and Detective Morrison had evolved into a professional partnership that combined law enforcement experience with scientific expertise to address emerging threats in educational settings. Their joint presentations at national security conferences had established new protocols for assessing and managing potential risks posed by individuals with advanced technical knowledge working in sensitive environments. Rebecca's consulting work with federal agencies had expanded beyond educational security to include pharmaceutical safety assessments and chemical weapons detection protocols. Her ability to think like both a researcher and a potential threat made her invaluable for identifying vulnerabilities in security systems that protected critical infrastructure and sensitive materials. The scientific paper that Rebecca co-authored with Dr. Yang describing ethical frameworks for managing dual-use research knowledge had been published in the Journal of Applied Ethics and was becoming required reading for graduate students in chemistry and related fields. Their work addressed the moral obligations of scientists whose research could be weaponized, providing guidance for professionals who were struggling to balance knowledge sharing with security concerns. Lisa Park had graduated as valedictorian and was attending MIT on a full scholarship, specifically designed for students interested in chemical safety and homeland security applications. Her senior thesis on the ethical implications of dangerous knowledge in educational settings had been cited by policy experts who were developing new guidelines for STEM education in an era of heightened security awareness. The mentoring relationship that had developed between Lisa and Rebecca continued through weekly video calls that provided academic guidance while also offering support for navigating the complex moral questions that arose when studying potentially dangerous subjects. Lisa's career trajectory had been profoundly influenced by witnessing how knowledge could be both dangerous and beneficial, depending on the character and intentions of the person who possessed it. The Lincoln Valley Educational Security Institute that opened in the renovated wing of the high school had become a regional training center for teachers, law enforcement officers, and emergency responders who needed to understand chemical threats and appropriate response protocols. The facility combined state-of-the-art laboratory equipment with simulation environments that allowed trainees to practice handling dangerous situations without actual risk. Rebecca's position as director of the institute had given her opportunities to influence policy and practice at levels that extended far beyond her original teaching role. Her work was shaping how educational institutions across the country approach the challenge of maintaining safety while preserving the open intellectual environment necessary for effective learning. The annual conference hosted by the Institute brought together experts from education, law enforcement, and national security agencies to share research and develop best practices for managing knowledge-based threats in civilian settings. The interdisciplinary collaboration fostered by these gatherings was producing innovative solutions to problems that had previously been addressed separately by different professional communities. The federal grant funding that supported the institute's operations reflected recognition at the highest levels of government that Rebecca's approach to integrating education with security awareness represented a crucial evolution in how democratic societies protected themselves without compromising their fundamental values. Her work was being studied internationally as a model for other countries facing similar challenges. The psychological evaluation protocols that Dr. Rodriguez had developed for assessing individuals with potentially dangerous expertise were being adopted by hiring managers in industries ranging from pharmaceuticals to aerospace engineering. His research on the factors that predicted whether technical knowledge would be used constructively or destructively was influencing personnel security practices across multiple sectors. The legal precedents established by the prosecution of Marcus and his friends had clarified the responsibilities of educational institutions for protecting personnel who might be targeted because of their specialized knowledge or capabilities. The court decisions had strengthened protections for teachers while also establishing clearer guidelines for appropriate disclosure of background information that might be relevant to institutional security. The transformation of Rebecca's basement laboratory from a hidden reminder of her abandoned career into an active research facility supporting community safety initiatives symbolized her successful integration of past expertise with current mission. The equipment that had once represented dangerous capabilities she was trying to suppress had become tools for protecting others and advancing knowledge in service of public welfare. The coffee-stained dress that had triggered the revelation of Rebecca's hidden expertise had been preserved as evidence during the legal proceedings, but Rebecca had chosen to donate it to a museum exhibit on workplace harassment and personal resilience. The artifact served as a reminder that moments of crisis could become catalysts for positive transformation when individuals choose courage over victimhood. The speaking engagements that took Rebecca to universities and professional conferences across the country had established her as a leading voice in discussions about the intersection of knowledge, power, and responsibility in democratic societies. Her presentations combined personal narrative with policy analysis to illustrate how individual choices about the use of expertise could have far-reaching implications for community, welfare, and national security. 3 years had passed since the morning when scalding coffee transformed a quiet chemistry teacher into a national figure, whose work was reshaping how America approached the intersection of education, security, and scientific knowledge. The woman who now stood before the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization in Paris bore little resemblance to the timid educator who had once hidden her expertise behind cardigans and careful anonymity. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had been invited to address the International Assembly about developing global standards for managing dual-use scientific knowledge in educational settings. Her presentation would influence policy decisions affecting millions of students and teachers worldwide, establishing protocols for identifying and supporting educators whose backgrounds included potentially sensitive expertise, while maintaining the open intellectual environment essential for scientific progress. The recognition that Rebecca's story represented more than an isolated incident of workplace harassment had emerged gradually as similar cases surfaced across multiple countries. Teachers, professors, and researchers with backgrounds in chemistry, biology, physics, and engineering were revealing that they too had faced harassment or discrimination because their knowledge was perceived as threatening by those who misunderstood the relationship between scientific capability and personal character. The international movement that had grown from Rebecca's experience was producing concrete changes in how educational institutions worldwide approached personnel security, professional development, and crisis response. The framework she had developed for integrating security awareness with academic instruction were being adapted for use in schools from rural American communities to urban centers in developing nations facing their own unique challenges. Marcus Thompson had completed his bachelor's degree in social work and was beginning graduate studies in conflict resolution at Georgetown University. His master's thesis research focused on the psychological factors that transformed ordinary students into bullies, drawing on his own experiences to develop intervention strategies that addressed root causes rather than simply punishing harmful behavior after it occurred. The young man who had once terrorized classmates was now working with middle school students in Washington, D.C., helping them develop emotional intelligence and conflict resolution skills that would prevent them from following the destructive path he had once chosen. His transformation had become a case study in rehabilitation programs that emphasized accountability, empathy development, and constructive contribution to community welfare. The scholarship program that Marcus had established using settlement money from civil litigation related to his harassment campaign was providing educational opportunities for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who demonstrated potential for positive leadership. His commitment to funding the education of young people who might otherwise lack access to higher learning represented his ongoing effort to repair the damage caused by his previous actions. Jake Williams had joined the Pennsylvania State Police after completing his criminal justice degree, specializing in youth intervention programs that prevented at-risk teenagers from engaging in violent or destructive behavior. His personal experience with anger management and behavioral change gave him credibility with young people who were struggling with similar challenges, while his law enforcement training provided him with practical tools for intervention and support. The Police Athletic League program that Jake had developed combined physical fitness with character education, using sports activities to teach lessons about teamwork, respect, and personal responsibility. His work with troubled youth had earned recognition from state officials who were seeking effective approaches to juvenile crime prevention, and his programs were being replicated in communities throughout the region. Connor Davis had earned his doctorate in forensic psychology and was working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to develop psychological profiles of individuals who might use scientific knowledge for destructive purposes. His unique perspective as someone who had once engaged in systematic harassment gave him insights into the mindset and motivations that drove people to abuse power or knowledge in ways that harmed others. The research that Connor was conducting on the intersection of intelligence, personality disorders, and antisocial behavior was contributing to early warning systems that could identify potential threats before they materialized into actual violence. His work was helping law enforcement agencies understand the difference between legitimate scientific research and activities that might indicate preparation for harmful applications of technical knowledge. Dr. Amanda Foster had been appointed as the first Director of Educational Security for the Pennsylvania Department of Education, overseeing the implementation of safety protocols that protected both students and personnel while maintaining academic freedom and intellectual openness. Her policies were becoming models for other states that were struggling to balance security concerns with educational mission requirements. The training programs that Amanda had developed for school administrators were addressing the complex challenges of managing personnel whose backgrounds included potentially sensitive knowledge or capabilities. Her work was helping educational leaders understand when disclosure requirements were appropriate and when they represented unnecessary intrusions into personal privacy that could discourage qualified candidates from pursuing teaching careers. Detective Morrison had been promoted to head the newly created Educational Threat Assessment Unit, which provided law enforcement support for schools and universities dealing with security concerns related to scientific knowledge or research activities. Her partnership with Rebecca had established protocols for distinguishing between legitimate educational activities and potential threats that required intervention. The database that Morrison's unit maintained tracked individuals with advanced technical knowledge who were working in educational settings, not for surveillance purposes, but to ensure that appropriate support and resources were available if security concerns arose. The system balanced privacy protections with institutional safety needs, providing a model for other jurisdictions that were developing similar capabilities. Lisa Park had completed her undergraduate studies at MIT with highest honors and was beginning doctoral research in chemical safety engineering at Stanford University. Her dissertation project focused on developing detection systems that could identify dangerous chemical synthesis activities in educational laboratories while distinguishing them from legitimate instructional demonstrations. The mentoring relationship that continued between Lisa and Rebecca had evolved into a professional collaboration that was producing research publications and policy recommendations for managing scientific knowledge in educational settings. Their work was influencing how universities approached graduate student supervision and research oversight in fields with potential dual-use applications. The Lincoln Valley Educational Security Institute had expanded into a multi-campus network that provided training and consultation services to educational institutions throughout North America. The success of Rebecca's integrated approach to security education had generated demand for similar programs in other regions, leading to the establishment of affiliated centers in Texas, California, and Ontario. The research conducted at these affiliated centers was advancing understanding of how scientific knowledge could be shared safely while minimizing risks of misuse by individuals with malicious intentions. The publications emerging from this work were influencing international discussions about the balance between open science and security considerations in an era of global terrorism and technological threats. The Nobel Peace Prize nomination that Rebecca had received for her contributions to educational security and international cooperation reflected recognition that her work was addressing fundamental challenges facing democratic societies in the 21st century. While she had not won the prize, the nomination itself had elevated her profile and expanded opportunities for influencing policy at the highest levels of international governance. The documentary series that followed Rebecca's continuing work had been translated into 37 languages and was being used in classrooms worldwide to teach students about the ethical dimensions of scientific knowledge and the responsibilities that came with advanced education. The global reach of her story was inspiring a new generation of scientists who understood that their expertise carried obligations to serve humanity rather than personal ambition. The memorial scholarship established in honor of the coffee-stained dress that had triggered Rebecca's transformation was providing annual awards to educators who demonstrated exceptional courage in the face of workplace harassment or institutional pressure. The scholarship recipients were teachers and professors who had stood up for their principles despite personal or professional costs, continuing the legacy of integrity that had defined Rebecca's response to her own crisis. The International Conference on Educational Security that Rebecca organized annually brought together experts from dozens of countries to share research, develop best practices, and coordinate responses to emerging threats in educational settings. The conference had become the premier forum for addressing the complex challenges of protecting schools and universities while preserving their essential functions as centers of learning and discovery. As Rebecca concluded her address to the UNESCO Assembly, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from a hidden basement laboratory to an international stage, where her words would influence the education and safety of millions of students worldwide. The transformation from victim to leader had required her to confront fundamental questions about knowledge, power, and responsibility that continued to shape her work and perspective. The applause that followed her presentation represented more than appreciation for a compelling speech. It was recognition of the broader transformation that her story represented. The demonstration that moments of crisis could become catalysts for positive change when individuals choose courage over fear, service over self-interest, and hope over despair had inspired millions of people who faced their own challenges and opportunities for making a difference. The coffee that had been thrown with malicious intent had become the first drop in a chemical reaction that would continue generating positive change for generations to come. The woman who had once hidden her dangerous knowledge was now using that same expertise to protect others and advance human welfare, proving that even the most painful experiences could be transformed into sources of strength and service when approached with wisdom, courage, and commitment to something greater than personal comfort or security. The legacy would continue through the thousands of students, teachers, and security professionals who had been influenced by Rebecca's example and teachings, carrying forward the principles of integrated strength and compassionate leadership into their own spheres of influence and responsibility. The story that began with teenage cruelty and personal humiliation had become a testament to the transformative power of authentic courage and the choice to use personal capabilities in service of justice, protection, and the common good. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.